Welcome to the dispersed workshop, Missionary Objects and Collecting 16th-20th Centuries. I am Sabina Brevaglieri, and I'm thrilled to launch a talk series I have designed and convened as a first step into a project aiming to contribute to the collective undertaking of thinking the future of non-European objects and collections in Europe today. This set of talks explore the missionary engagement with object and collecting through time and space. Missionary object is an operational concept which draws the attention to the complex dynamic of both physical mobility and cultural transformation, which permeate the tension between object produced and belonging to local indigenous communities around the world and the missionary agency. The complex entanglement between missionary object and collecting and the competitive and conflictual colonial spaces is a major issue for this work. Indeed, colonial logics, asymmetrical power relations, and jurisdictional competition can hardly be separated from missionary action. However, missionaries are religious actors, and their experience and personal engagement in the local field are integral to apostolic commitment and evangelization purposes. Religion emerges as substantial driving force in shaping a complex meaning of missionary objects, as well as in continuously reconfiguring them and their context. This series engages with missionary practices of object attention, selection, accumulation, and monopolization. Creative practices of resistance, keeping alive the indigenous worship, have been addressed, as well as anti-idolatry campaigns aimed at the physical material destruction or epistemic aggression of the sacred matter. Such violent actions generated complex forms of missionary knowledge on indigenous objects, which mediated their agency into the colonial archives and museums. Missionary travels and circulation across the world triggered complex perception and reception dynamics. Display and exposition create new publics. Competing patrimonialization processes underpin the current question of object preservation as an entangled right the objects embodies. The talks investigate South and Mesoamerica, Philippines, China, Ethiopia, the Congo, as well as Italy and Rome. The series provide the possibility to compare different forms and situations of missionary engagement by focusing on Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits and Capuchins, as well as Saverians. The talks argues for a long-lasting missionary attention to objects and engagement with collecting practices. Still existing objects today preserved in European museums are being addressed as material evidence of discontinuous and often invisible dynamics of both eradication and sedimentation, which reconfigure their meanings, uses, and values through time. Therefore, talks trace back to the 16th centuries and early modern times, aiming to unravel object histories and meaning well beyond the culture of curiosity. Within this framework, the 19th and 20th centuries missionary museological thinking have been addressed, and under-investigated missionary museums imbued with ethnocentric connotation and strong colonial imagination are being explored. This exploratory series concentrates on the Catholic world to draft both an innovative research agenda and new methodological tools, which has to be expanded through comparison and entanglement with other denominations and religions. This dispersed workshop represents an attempt to overcome separation between disciplines and scholarly communities and foster dialogue, cooperation, and partnership between universities and museums. I would like to warmly thank all speakers, institutional partners, colleagues and participants for such a collective undertaking. I wish you a stimulating visit through the dispersed workshop missionary objects and collecting. Enjoy the talk.
The title of my paper today will be Handling Sacrifice, Reception and Perception of Mesoamerican Knives in Early Modern Italy. And it is part of a wider research I've been doing in recent years about the cultural biographies of this set of objects that you see in this slide. I'm sure that even those of you who are not too familiar with ancient Mesoamerica would immediately recognize some iconic objects, such as, for example, this double-headed serpent, which is at the British Museum today. All the objects that you see in this image have a common trait. They were all in Italy in the 16th century. Some of them are still in Italy, some not. But the interesting thing is that Italy held for many centuries a veritable treasure of Mesoamerican objects, in contrast to what happened in Spain. We know that Spain received hundreds of similar objects sent by conquistadors, but for various reasons, no single object of those shipments is extant today, or at least maybe some of them could be extant in Vienna or coming from other areas of Central Europe, but those which remained in Spain were somehow destroyed or lost. A very different situation characterizes Italy, and it is due, at least to my own take on this problem, to their very specific conditions of collecting, of original collecting in the Americas, and the ways in which they reached Europe. As I said, all these objects were in Italy, and all of them can be traced with different degrees of certainty to the Dominican world. Most of these objects, if not all, were brought to Italy by Dominican missionaries. Obviously, it is not by chance, and my work is trying to understand why and which reasons push these missionaries to save, to preserve objects that, as you can see, are not Christian products of Christianized Indians, but rather were products of pre-Columbian indigenous people, so witnessing idolatrous practices. Most of these objects, well, part of them at least, were brought by, this person on the right, Domingo de Betanzos, who was the founder of the Dominican order in Mexico, and who in between 1532 and 33 traveled to Italy to meet Clement VII, Giulio de' Medici, to ask for the independence of the Dominican province in Mexico, which was at the time dependent from the Hispaniola province. So he arrived, Betanzos arrived in Naples, where the general capital of the Dominicans was going to be held, and then met Clement VII for the first time in Rome, where he gave him a gift, including indigenous products. And then he met again Clement VII in Bologna in 1533, giving him a second gift, which we know in detail thanks to a source that I will show you in a moment. So that's the main provenance event, as I like to call them, related with that group of artifacts that I show you in the first slide. It is not the only one. We know at least of a second event still related with a Dominican friar, and I suspect that probably a third one in between could have happened, but I'm still looking for documental evidence of that. Now, this is the general frame of my research in recent years, but tonight I want to, I'm sorry, to focus my attention on a specific set of objects that is knives, sacrificial or different kind of knives. 3 of them are still extant. You see them in this slide. The central one with its original blade is today at the British Museum, while the other 2, which are the handles of 2 sacrificial knives, are today at the Museo delle Civiltà in Rome. And I want to focus on these objects because these objects are quite obviously, but as we will see, they have quite an unexpected relation with the practice of sacrifice. So when I started thinking about this paper, I thought, okay, sacrifice, it's an interesting topic to see how it works in the missional discourse that underwent the shipping, the bringing of this object to Italy. But we will see that the presence of sacrifice is pretty curious, the way in which knives of different kinds were interpreted in Italy. In the first part of my paper, I will talk about this Dominican phase and the kind of discourses that underwrote their perception of this kind of objects. And then I will follow the biography, the cultural biography of those knives up until today. Obviously, the more recent part, I will just do it very briefly, not to leave my discourse at a certain point, but we'll be focusing mostly on early modern phases. Since the very first meeting, it is not the first source, but because the source is this Historia della Fundazione di Discurso della Provincia di Santo Domingo de México, de Davide Padilla, Dominican author, published in 1596, but this is the source that describes the first meeting between Betanzos and Clement VII in Rome. And as you can see, Davide Padilla wrote, they took out some tools which the idolaters employed to sacrifice men to the devil, and especially some double-edged blades, very sharp, very shiny and showy, much more sharp and penetrating with a strange subtlety. Since this very first and brief phrase, we see an interesting aspect that he speaks about sacrificial knives. He mentions sacrifice, human sacrifice to the devil, but immediately he focuses his attention on a specific kind of blades. He called them double-edged blades, which are obviously, and we will see that they will come up very often, what today we call obsidian prismatic blades, which were a very typical product of Mesoamerican lithic industry. And so we will see that a certain, basically these Dominicans brought to Italy two kinds of knives, and these two kinds of knives were associated with very diverse and different interpretive discourses. The so-called sacrificial knife, associated to human sacrifice, but as we will see, they won't attract very much attention, while the second kind of objects would be much more interesting in the eyes of the Dominicans and even of the Italian persons who met these kind of objects from 1532 onward. The second encounter between Betanzos and Clement VII in Bologna was described by Leandro Alberti, a Dominican historian who wrote the Historia di Bologna. The first book that you see on the left was published, the other books remained unpublished. But in that history of the city of Bologna, he described the second meeting between Clement VII and Charles V in 1533, 3 years before the Pope had crowned Charles V in Bologna, and then they met the famous second meeting for different political reasons. It was on that second meeting that Betanzos also had his second meeting with Clement VII. He met the Pope, and according to Leandro Alberti, he gave him a rich gift, including mosaic masks, pictorial manuscripts, idols, and feather works. And among this huge group of objects, there were also knives. And Alberti writes, then Betanzos gave a 2 fingers wide and 2 ounces long knife made of yellow stone with the handle entirely covered by turquoises. Then some stone knives that cut like razors, which they used for shaving. By these knives, we knew the kind of those knives of which the Bible speaks when the Lord says, make me the stone knives to circumcise. Among these things, I received some books, knives, and the big knife used to kill men, to sacrifice them to their idols. So as you can see, On one side, Alberti mentions these sacrificial knives with flint blade and the handles covered by turquoises, and he stresses that they were used to kill men, to sacrifice them to their idols. But he also mentioned this second kind of knives. They will be called, always be called razors in Italy. And it says that they were used for shaving, but it says something surprising here. By these knives, we knew the kind of those knives of which the Bible speaks. So I would say that this is a typical antiquarian mindset, putting together things and text, putting them in relation, but usually texts were employed to interpret objects, material culture, and especially if the text in question is the Bible. But here, as you can see, the relationship is kind of the other way around. So according to Alberti, looking at Mesoamerican obsidian blade, the observer could understand which kind of knives were mentioned in the Old Testament, in that part where Lord commands the creation of knives to circumcise. And this is the first appearance in this Dominican text of this idea that those blades were employed for circumcision, which is obviously not true. Mesoamerican didn't practice circumcision, but this is an idea that has been recorded at least since Juan Diaz, who took part in the first Grijalva expedition in Mexico. And he wrote that Mesoamericans used to sacrifice themselves. Actually, they used to let blood from their genitals, so it was a form of auto-sacrifice, but that here it is interpreted as a form of circumcision. The very same topic appears in another source, which is the Descrizione dell'India Occidentale, an Italian source, which, according to my interpretation, it is anonymous, undated, without any place of printing. But according to my own view, it was published in Venice between 1564 and 1570. And it tells the story of a priest coming from Mexico, most probably a Dominican, because it says that he had been evangelizing Mixtec and Zapotec natives in Oaxaca, that is in a Dominican area, who came to Italy. And the text basically describes the objects that these priests brought to Italy. And among them, as you can see, there are the stone knives, which they used to sacrifice men and children in the temple. So let's call them the sacrificial knife with sculptural handles, and some black porphyry razors that they used to circumcise, as the Jews used to do. So now circumcision is clearly, explicitly mentioned as a way to create an analogy between indigenous people from Mexico and the Jews. It is important to stress in this respect that these Dominican sources never mention the hypothesis of Jew origin of Native American Indians, which were, as you obviously know, it was a very well-known hypothesis about their ultimate origin. Here, this analogy is not employed to build a story of the origin of the natives, but it's rather, at least in my opinion, used to locate indigenous people within a specific place in time, in Judeo-Christian time, that is along the path that will lead them to conversion, to their transformation into fully blown Christians. An entire paragraph of the Descrizione is devoted to knives. And again, it is, well, I divided the two paragraphs, but as you can see, the first one, it says, they used to sacrifice men with some knives made out of flint, very hard, and the priest kept them in the temple. The religious men took 2 of these knives, and they are those that are shown together with the other things. The priest used to slide these knives under the left breast of the living victim, and putting the hand inside, he took out the earth, and with the palpitating earth, he anointed the face of the idol. And this was their way of sacrificing. So there is a pretty gruesome description of human sacrifice, taking the occasion of the presence of the physical. The description of human sacrifice is quite, I would say, formulaic, quite usual. The ultimate source of this description is Cortés, Hernán Cortés. In his letter, he mentioned this idea of anointing the mouth of the idol with the blood. But the immediate source, it is obviously the so-called anonymous conqueror, an Italian text published by Ramusio, translated by Alfonso de Ulloa, who, at least in my opinion, could be the anonymous author of this Descrizione too. And the two texts share many, many elements, and this is one of those elements which clearly denounce the relationship between the two sources. But as you can see, in the paragraph devoted to Nice gives much more space to the second kind of blades, saying they have two other kinds of black porphyry razors, with point and with no point, to sacrifice themselves, letting blood from the ears and from the tongue and from the shameful part. And these razors, cut as they were of fine steel, they are made out of a rock with a wooden tool, and they come off with a single strike, with the cutting edge and with the point. They are 1 palm long. So again, he calls them razors. He describes auto-sacrifice. He knows the practice of auto-sacrifice, and he mentions the technique, the technology of flint napping. That is the way in which indigenous people produced these incredibly sharp blades. And then he had another description of another object brought by the priest. Together with the idols, they also took a certain wooden tool used to circumcise, as the Jews used to do. That is an ebony tablet, 2 fingers wide and 1 span long. And on the lower side, it has a black porphyry razor. And with that tablet, they used to circumcise over a round and wooden board. So again, the second kind of blades are associated with circumcision. They circumcise as the Jews used to do. Now, this discourse of knives has to be put in the context of the wider discourse of these sources, and the most clear is the Descrizione, in which basically Mesoamerican artifacts are used as tangible evidence of indigenous idolatry, but thanks to their extreme technical quality, they are also witnessing the intellectual qualities of the persons who made them. Thus, they were at the same time witnessing idolatrous practices, and also the potential to overcome idolatry, because all these objects and their marvelous technical properties are seen as proofs of the fact that indigenous people are endowed with ingenio, a specific intellectual quality which in early modern times was associated with the idea of connecting things, putting together complex things. So it was at the base, for example, of the creation of metaphors, and it was strictly related with mechanical arts. So they are saying that these objects are a proof of the ingenium of indigenous people, the very possibility of being converted. And remember that these texts were written when these Dominicans came to Italy to ask for privileges for their provinces, so they had to testify the importance of the work they were doing. And so they were saying indigenous people can be converted, and these objects are the proof of the idolatry we want to cancel, but also of the intellectual potential of the indigenous people. And there is a very refined rhetorical play, because the word ingenio means the intellectual quality, but also a complex object, as is the ingenio for producing sugar, for example. And so they speak about ingenios, referring both to the object and to the intellectual qualities required to produce those objects. Now, the hidden reference in these text is obviously Bartolomé de las Casas, who in the Apologetica Historia Summaria devoted a long passage to obsidian blades. And now I'm not going to read all these texts, but it's interesting to see how many words he employs to describe precisely that flint knapping technique that it was alluded in the Descrizione. Las Casas say there were artisans of stone blades, and it is wonderful to see how the blades are made, and the very fact that they do them in this way, and I don't know if I can explain it. And then he starts this long description of this technique that you see here illustrated in the Relación de Michoacán, employing this wooden tool. But what is interesting is to see how Las Casas ends his paragraph, saying, seeing their production is worth of admiration, and the fact that they devise such an art is no small argument in favor of the liveliness of their genius of the man that devised such a working method. So this here is explicit. The very fact that they devise such incredible technique to produce blades is a proof of the viveza de los ingenios, of their intellectual qualities. It is obviously the text that the authors of Alberti and the author of the Descrizione had in mind, where they described those blades, their quality, and even describing the flint knapping techniques. And this was a very famous text. It was basically copied word by word by Mendieta, and afterward by Torquemada. They repeated these long passages. The other element which shares...
Poi puoi entrare, Dario, io sono...
there is a microphone open, Claudia.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. The other kind of objects which complete this kind of discourse are feather works with Christian imagery. So stone blades and, well, sacrificial knives represent sacrifice, idolatry. These blades represent bloodletting, but also circumcision. And obviously making this analogy with Jews means locating Native Americans in the same time position along the Judeo-Christian vision of time, the same position that Jews had, that is just before. They are persons who are just before the possibility to be converted. And this flint knapping technique is the proof that they can be converted, and the proof that they had already been converted are feather works with Christian imagery. So the different artifacts brought by the Dominicans do play different roles along in the different parts, let's say, of Dominican discourse. Now, this is basically the general framework in which these objects arrived in Italy, brought by Dominicans in order to sustain a specifically Dominican colonial project. It is a colonial project, obviously, aimed at, it's a transforming colonial project. They want to transform indigenous people into fully blown Christians. And so objects are proxies employed to kind of think about the qualities of these men that they want to transform. We don't know to which extent the receivers of these objects in Italy understood this kind of discourse. It was obviously elaborated by Dominican authors, but who knows to which degree Clement VII paid attention to that. What we know is that brought by these Dominican objects soon entered a completely different sphere, intellectual and social sphere, which is the sphere of art collectors in Italy. And this is the reason why in Italy these objects were preserved, while in Spain they were not. Because in Italy there was a lively group of collectors which were kind of ready to receive these objects. And as you may remember, well, as you can see here, Alberti says, I received some book, Knives and the Big Knife Just to Kill Men, etc., which I gave to Mr. Giovanni Achillino to decorate his museum together with a book and a stone knife similar to a razor. So he gave a book and two knives, each one of the two kind, to Giovanni Achellino. Giovanni Achellino was a musician, a poet, well known in Bologna. Unfortunately, his museum was lost. We have no news of what happened to his museum, but obviously he preserved these two knives. And for some reason, he probably gave them to Antonio Giganti, because a few years later, in the inventory of the collection of Antonio Giganti, we find a stone sacrificial knife with a wooden handle and a stone razor. So probably the two, or we cannot be sure, but they're most probably the same two that were given to Giovanni Achellino. And we know that the collection of Antonio Giganti later on passed into the hands of Ulisse Aldrovandi, the famous Bolognese polymath who assembled a huge museum in his house in Bologna. And thanks to the publication of Aldrovandi, we can have an idea of the way in which these knives were completely resignified in the eyes of a natural historian who was looking at this object not because he was interested in the in indigenous American position related with conversion. He was not even very much interested, at least in my opinion, in indigenous American customs. What he was doing was kind of trying to apply the Aristotelian taxonomic structure to the new realities. And so he looked at Mesoamerican knives with a very, very peculiar gaze, if we can use this term. As you can see, in the Museum Metallicum, the book was published posthumous in 1648, many years after Aldorandi's death, but he had prepared, we know that he had prepared all these manuscripts that he donated to the city of Bologna together with the museum in 1603. And so in 1648, Bartolomeo Ambrosini, who was the curator of the Aldorandi Museum, was in charge of the publication of the volumes of his Storia Naturale, published this volume. And here Aldorandi wrote, in the India province of Temistitan, since they have no iron and steel, they produce knives with an emerald green or dark stone, which some call Ethiopic stone, with very elegant handles, of which we place before the reader's eye two images. The first one shows a larger knife with a finely sculpted wooden handle. The second image shows a longer and narrower knife with the handle made of jade. And that's all. That's all Aldorandi wrote. And this is interesting. You can see the same two kinds of knives. But as you can see, and in complete agreement with the topic of the book, Museum Metallicum is a book devoted to stones and metals. So his interest is completely focused on materiality. So he's speaking about iron. He mentioned this very common trope of 16th century texts about the fact that Native Americans didn't employ iron and steel. And he started talking about these objects. But as you can see, he focuses attention on the stone. He calls it a stone. It is a glass, actually. But it's interesting. I think this is the earliest mention of the existence of both green and black obsidian. Green obsidian is obsidian from a specific area, the Sierra de las Navajas in Hidalgo, Mexico. And he mentions the handle. He mentions here that this handle is a jade one, which is something completely unseen. We have no archaeological evidence of the use of jade handles for this kind of obsidian blades. But as you can see, Aldorandi didn't write not a single word on, for example, this bird, etc. So no space for intellectual detours. He's only interested in materiality. And he's basically classifying these objects within the overarching classification of stones and metals that he's doing in his book. So we have a completely different mindset. The natural historian looks at these objects with this idea. And as you can see, sacrifice disappears. And as we will see in a moment, this disappearing of sacrifice will last for centuries, which is kind of counterintuitive. But as we will see, nobody will speak about sacrifice for centuries. Similar blades in the late 16th century appeared the collection of Ferranti Imperatore, another natural historian or doctor who assembled a famous museum in Naples. And in his book, De Storia Naturale, as you can see, he published 2 obsidian blades. Now, I cannot tell, obviously, how Imperator got these blades. A person who published a couple of articles, Montana published a couple of articles on Imperator, kind of proposed that Imperator could have copied this image from the manuscript that Recco made in Spain, kind of copying Francisco Hernandez's work and then bringing them to Italy and passing them to Cesi, a topic that Sabina knows much better than I do, but I really do not agree with this idea. We have no evidence at all that Hernandez did drawings of obsidian blades. And I put here an image of a prismatic obsidian blade to show you how this part, the proximal end, compare the proximal end here and the proximal end here. This is a perfect representation of an obsidian blade. Here on the rear side, for those of you who are expert in flint knapping, you can see the percussion bulb and the small depression here that it follows immediately. I'm sure this is a drawing, well, a woodcut of an actual object. Nobody would have been able to copy in such a perfect way these details of flint knapping. So Imperator must have had this object in his hands. And as I said, Betanzos stayed months in Naples before giving his gifts in Rome and Bologna to Clement VII. So that could be an hypothesis to be explored in the future. But let's see what Imperator wrote. Again, the fact that black pumice is denser is confirmed by glasses from quarries, which are black and dense, so that they are also apt to cut. And for this reason, the knives from West Indies made with similar stones are marvelously excellent. Again, another, I don't know how you want to call it, natural historian or physician or doctor, but a man of science, if you want, looks at this object with a mindset very similar to the one that we saw in Aldrovandi. No sacrifice, not even indigenous people. He's not looking at this object to think about faraway people. He's interested in materiality. I think that's a key phase in the Italian history of collecting. As you may understand from my whole talk, I really don't like the too common use of terms as cabinet of curiosities, Wunderkammer, which immediately bring us toward a kind of a too much repeated set of ideas. Collecting practices were much more varied, especially in Italy, especially in the 16th century, when this world of natural historians and doctors had absolutely a key role. And the story of these knives is quite telling in this sense. A very different phase starts in the 16th century. And the earliest, the 17th century. The early 17th century mentioning an Italian knife, Mesoamerican knife, is a letter that Jacob Gaffarel, the famous scholar who was the librarian of Cardinal Richelieu, wrote to Antonio Licetti in Italy. The letter was signed in Venice on September 17, 1633. And as you can see, Gaffarel wrote, "And if your lordship would like to mention an Egyptian idol, which I happen to have, reproducing its figure in your book, you may do a great service to the public. I gave a picture of it to Mr. Odio, who will present it to your lordship. You will see that as far as thunderbolts are concerned, it is impossible to imagine a better antique." So Gaffarel is in Venice and is sending to Licetti the image of an object which he thinks could be interesting for a person that, as we will see, is writing a book on thunderbolts. And it calls it an Egyptian idol. Now, this is this is Fortunio Licetti, and this is the book he was writing, the Pironarca si vede fulminum natura, so a book on thunderbolts. And Fortunio Licetti received from this Mr. Rodio, I've been unable at the moment to identify who is this person, but he obviously liked the image that Gaffarel sent him, so that he published this image, which is the handle, one handle of a sacrificial knife with three-dimensional and mosaic encrusted handle. In the text, which is a very long text, I didn't copy it because it's too long, a Latin text, he describes in detail the mosaics, saying which kind of colors he can see. He describes these motifs. And basically, he says that this was found in archaeological ruins in Libya by a merchant from Memphis. And so he starts saying that this is an idol of thunderbolts who was adored in Libya and in a place related with ancient Egypt. So as you can see, we have a completely new intellectual framework. Obviously, we are in the 17th century. This Egyptomania has already boomed. Kircher is the most obvious example which comes to mind. And so they start seeing that this object, obviously, they start losing the knowledge, the specific knowledge that Dominican missionaries brought, because Dominican missionaries were perfectly knowledgeable about this object. But in time, people kind of forget those information. And so they start kind of elaborating on a possible Egyptian origin of this idol. And something similar happens in Bologna, where the two different knives arrive in the collection of Ferdinando Cospi, the famous creator of the Cospi Museum. He was the agent of the Grand Duke of Tuscany in Bologna. And the collection of Cospi has been described in 1677 by Lorenzo Legati in a book, the Museo Cospiano, that you see here. Actually, book 5 was written after Legati's death by Silvestro Bonfiglioli. And as you can see, he reproduced here two handles of Mesoamerican knives, calling them delle Sphinxes, Sphinxes. So again, Egypt, again, Sphinxes. Now, these objects are well known, and I can see that in the audience there is Loretta Paderni from the Museo della Civiltà in Rome, who perfectly knows these two handles, which are today in Rome. And Bonfiglioli writes a long text. I only copied here part of it, and in the final part, the underlined one, he says, to which use they were devoted and which name they could have, I cannot guess. I perfectly know that some people imagine, also based on Plutarch, that the union between a human and a beast could sometimes produce a certain being called Sphinx, which the Egyptian represented as a lion with the face of a virgin woman. And then he starts writing about Sphinxes. It is nice to see that apparently he's not really convinced about this interpretation of this object as Sphinxes, but probably that interpretation was given by Cospi himself, because it, as we will see, it comes up in inventories, etc. So basically they were seen as Sphinxes. And as you may see, again, sacrifice is totally absent, continues to be absent, and they don't even understand the function of those objects. And that's really interesting, because if you look at the two handles in Rome today, you can see here the socket of the blade, which was infilled with some kind of resin. Now here a piece of it is lost, but look at this one, it's completely infilled. So they, obviously, when they were in the Cospi collection, they had already been infilled with this material, so that this kind of impeded them to understand that these were knife handles. So they look at them as sculptors of sphinxes or idols. In 1742, the two museums, the Cospi and the Aldobrandi one, were sent from Palazzo Pubblico in Bologna to the Accademia dell'Istituto delle Scienze. In that moment, the big patron of the Accademia was Benedict XIV, the Bolognese Pope. And they entered there and they were exhibited in a room called Stanza dell'Antichità. So basically the two historic collections, which had been displayed in Bologna for more than a century, in contiguous room, but maintaining their original structure, they were kind of disassembled, reorganized in thematic rooms, the natural history one, the fossil one, etc. And so one room was the Stanza dell'Antichità, the antiquities room, where the Mesoamerican objects were displayed together with Greek, Egyptian, Roman antiquities. It is clearly a reflection of the enlightened ideas of the division of knowledge, compartmentation of knowledge. And as you can see in the inventory of the Cospi Museum, when they moved it to the Stanza dell'Antichità, you can read here, due Sphinge alla mosaica, two sphinx, mosaic sphinxes. So this idea that these objects are sphinxes remains kind of attached to them, but I would say mostly as a formulaic way of describing these two objects, especially in inventories, which are very synthetic. So that going ahead in time, in the Guida del Forestiere, which is a guide, a museum guide of the Museo of the University in Bologna, in 1803, the collection of the Accademia delle Scienze passed to the university, and they created this museum, and Schiassi published this guide. And as you can see, he mentioned the two objects as due Sfingi a mosaico di lavoro barbaro. So two mosaic sphinxes of barbarian work. Obviously, to me, the usage of the term barbarian has nothing to do with the complex meaning that this term had in the speculation of the 16th century Dominicans, which, as you all know, especially Las Casas wrote important pages about the very notion of barbarian. Here it's something that Schiassi employs to describe objects which are neither classical antiquities nor Chinese or Japanese things that is able to recognize. The things which do not match this classification are barbarian, something I would say exotic, far away, but I wouldn't say that it's not to be charged too much, because he also said there is another mask of barbarian work. And as you can see here below, he employed the same phrasing in 1835 when he wrote another inventory saying due Sfinge a mosaico di lavoro barbaro. So it's kind of a usual way of rapidly recording these objects. So we are now in 1835, and as you may have noticed, since Aldrovandi, published posthumous in 1648, but written in the second half of the 16th century, sacrifice has completely disappeared from the discourses. It was mentioned in the Dominican works of the 16th century, but where human sacrifice was kind of put aside by the relevance that obsidian blades, circumcision, and analogy with the Jews had in those texts, so that marginalization of human sacrifice, which is kind of unexpected, at least I was surprised when I realized that nobody speaks about sacrifice. And here again, at the beginning of the 19th century, it is still completely out of the picture. The next phases in the complex social life of these knives comes with their entrance in what we could say modern academic circles. As you all know, these two guys, Henry Christie, the famous London collector, made a trip to Cuba and Mexico. Apparently he met on a bus, Edward B. Tyler, the famous evolutionary anthropologist. And so they traveled together in Mexico in 1859. And they obviously became curious about Aztec productions. And so that when they came back to London, Henry Christie got notice of the fact that a collector, a German collector, but living in London, Bram Hertz, was selling his collection, and he had very important Aztec objects. And so he bought these objects, and among them, there was a very famous knife, which Edward Tyler published in his Anahuac, the book published in 1861, where he told the story of the trip to Mexico made together with Christie. And he mentioned the knife in the main text, and he even devoted a whole appendix to the mosaics which have been bought by Tyler. I cannot tell you the story of all these mosaics, but all of them come from Italy. So they were sold in the 19th century by noble families which were having hard times with the new fiscal policies of the Italian pre-unitary and states, and then with the Kingdom of Italy. Obviously, I'm sure most of you would have recognized that that knife is the one which is today at the British Museum, where the Christie collection ended up. And as you can see, it is interesting to see that, again, Tyler is only interested in materials. He wrote a lot about this chalcedony, saying that Humboldt had described the presence of this chalcedony in Mexico. So he's interested basically in materials. And then he had this very telling phrase: there is in the stone blade the curious fact of a people which attains to so complex a design and such elaborate ornamentation remaining in the Stone Age. And we are in the moment in evolutionary anthropology, so he's looking at this object according to that distinction of ages, Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, which had been created in the Museum of Copenhagen, as you all know, where a couple of important mosaics had been bought in Rome, mosaics of the same group, by Thomson, who was the guy who created this idea of the three ages. So there's lots of entanglement between these stories. In the meanwhile, in Italy, the objects in Bologna, progressively, as we saw in the 18th century, we had only small mentions in guides and inventories, no text devoted to their description and interpretation. They were progressively perceived as out of place. The Museum of Archaeology in Bologna was being transformed into a museum whose aim was to tell the story of Bologna, a local museum. And so they were perceived as objects out of place, which is an incredible error to me. Those objects had been in Bologna for centuries. They were part of Bologna's history, but they were kind of pushed away from Bologna's history. And so it was easy for Luigi Pigorini to go to Bologna and to ask for an exchange. He gave some pre-Etruscan vases to Bologna, and he got a wonderful collection of mosaics, among which the two handles that we saw. And I must say that Pigorini wrote an incredible article. He shows a knowledge, an academic knowledge, which nobody had in those times. He was the first to mention Aldrovandi, Licetti, all the works which I mentioned before. And as you can see, this is what Pigorini wrote. I do not know if anyone has made specific investigation on the use of these knives or daggers. I think, nevertheless, that we can concede that they were used in human sacrifices. It is well known that in Mexico, they used to open the chest of the victim with stone knives, which, according to the anonymous conqueror, were very large, as the blades of the knives I'm talking about. Moreover, the exquisite art of the handles and the preciousness of the material with which they are encrusted seem to clearly indicate that they were sacred tools. So, for the first time, human sacrifice comes back into the picture. And it does also because Pigorini knows the anonymous conqueror, which is the same source, strictly related with this Dominican sphere, which the author of the Descrizione was mentioning when he described human sacrifice. Again, talking about these knives. The knives elicited discourses in some way. So this is the first time in which the idea of human sacrifice comes back. Pigorini is able to understand that they are knife handles because he had read Edward Tyler's book, so he knows about the knife which is in London, and so he recognizes the similarity between those objects. Now, from Pigorini onward, the story is endless. These knives enter the academic world, and a host of publications were done. I only put images here because I'm sure I didn't mention it, but I'm sure that all along my paper, you would have noticed how visual sources are key in the to write, to follow the social life of this object. The production of images since the 16th century is a key aspect of this story. And so here you have various images in various books. I'm not gonna now cite all of them because it's too late. And this is, these are drawings of the specimen in London. Again, I repeat, this is from Venice probably, as the Licetti one. You can even see two different strands in the tradition. This is by Valdec, and it was copied then by Peñafiel, P. Margal, etc. And this is by Hercules Reed, copied by Oppel. So there are various lineages of images with, well, there is Peter Mason here in the public. I cannot speak about life of images, but they are nice examples to me. Now I'm pretty much done, but please, I ask you for 5 minutes more because I would, since there are Mesoamericanists in the audience, I would like to notice something more specifically for Mesoamericanists and also some more pop observation. These are the knives which arrived in Italy, which were part of this Dominican gift. I'm sure that it's not difficult to perfectly understand that these 4 knives do pertain to a same stylistic group. They are very similar. All, I cannot go into detail here, but they share lots of very specific micro elements. I just published an article on this, and they all represent crouching figures with the handling or the hand over the blade, while this one, which had no mosaic, as you may remember, is clearly different. Now, we are so used to see these knives that we tend to think that ancient sacrificial knives were done like that. But if we compare them with the extant specimens of knives with handle, with a known specimen, we can see that actually they are very, very different. These are from various provinces, central Mexico, Cañada de Cuicatlan, probably Oaxaca, Mixtec area. But as you can see, maybe this one, the wooden one, could have something to do with that. But the other ones, the so-called Italian, if you want, do represent a very, very specific group. And I think that this very specific group with a very specific collection history or provenance linked to Dominican missionaries, to me, they are clearly part of a specific group of mosaics, those that you can see here, which are obviously related both in terms of collection history and in terms of iconography to the Borgia group manuscript. I would bet that Domingo de Betanzos brought all the objects that you see in this image together in that as gifts. And for the Mesoamericanists, this is really interesting. I would say, I would call them these mosaics, the Borgia group mosaics. And archaeologically, we do not know any single mosaics from the Valley of Puebla, Tlaxcala. I would bet that these objects fill the void with the tradition of mosaic production in the Puebla, Tlaxcala Valley is represented by those mosaics as is represented by the local painting tradition is represented by manuscripts of the Borgia group. And this is interesting because provenance studies, the historical collections can provide very interesting hints on ultimate provenience and cultural attribution. And Mesoamericanists perfectly know that the cultural attribution of these objects has been an incredible problem, debated by generation of Mesoamericanists, speaking about Mixteca Puebla style, Aztec, Mixtec. I think that provenance study can provide very critical element to solve those problems. And I want to end with a more pop moment, very brief. So I try to show that these knives, these three knives, are a very specific group, not representative at all of all the sacrificial knives employed in Mesoamerica, but precisely due to that complex and very long social life they had in Italy. They became so iconic in Western thinking that we tend to associate human sacrifice with those objects. Paradoxically, because we are seeing that for centuries, nobody wrote about human sacrifice when looking at those objects, but so that if you Google Aztec sacrifice, one of the first results would be this page where you can recognize here the British Museum one, or if you are crazy enough to search for these horrible reproductions that you can buy on the web, you can see that they are either copies of the Italian knives or horrible stuff inspired, in this case, by the London one, which having the blade obviously works better in terms of shaping popular imagination about human sacrifice. And I was crazy enough to ask myself, oh, let's see which kind of knife they employed in the Apocalypto movie. And I found this image, and as you can see, they even created a new knife, which is a spondylus skeletal crouching figure. On the web, I also found a replica, not in spondylus, but representing the very same being. So they created kind of a new specimen of the same group, a postmodern specimen pertaining to that same group. This can look stupid, but to me, it's an interesting hint, interesting proof of the importance that those objects had in shaping our ideas, even popular ideas about Mesoamerican sacrifice, precisely due to the social life they had. And paradoxically, contemporary works are showing that probably they were not sacrificial implement at all. This is a radiograph done at the British Museum, which shows that the blade goes into the socket for a so small, this part is so small that this knife would have been very weak. Impossible to open the chest of a person with such a knife. And the fact that the two Museo della Civiltà specimens also lack blades is a suggestion that they were also very weak. And if you look at the belly of this animal, you can see that there is a hole. So these objects were not meant to be used as actual sacrificial knives, but they were actually part of godly insignia, which to me, it would be complex now to show it in detail, where something similar to these masks, shields, and weapons that we see associated with sacred bundles in Mesoamerican pictorial manuscript. Here you even see the 9-wind sacred bundle with a sacrificial knife on top. I don't think that the sacrificial knife was put like way I can imagine them as part of godly insignia. Remember that they arrived together with masks and other objects. So probably they were never used as sacrificial implements, but paradoxically today for us, they are the kind of the quintessential image of Mesoamerican sacrifice. So thanks to the activity of those missionaries, this object has so important life that, again, arrived to shape our imagination. We tend to think about missionaries burning ritual regalia in central Mexico, but actually we saw that missionaries also preserved, maybe not with the aim of preserving, but due to their activities, preserve some objects. Let me stress one last aspect. With this image, with Franciscans burning objects and a Dominican here bringing objects. I am not posing a dichotomy, Franciscan versus Dominicans. We know that Franciscans were key actors in recording indigenous knowledge, in preserving indigenous knowledge, but probably, and this is an open question, which I would do to persons who are much more knowledgeable than myself in the history of these orders, probably the Dominican order had a very peculiar attitude toward material culture. I'm not aware of similar attitude by the Franciscan toward indigenous material culture. And I would say that this peculiar attitude is linked precisely to that discourse that we read in Las Casas, which try to use material culture as a tangible evidence of their transformative colonial project. But we will see what you think. Thank you so much.